So last week we talked about making objectives, and I wanted to again talk about objectives because they are really important when we're looking at what we're going to be teaching our students. And I mentioned SMART objectives, and so the acronym SMART is here in um, a little visual for you, talking about how you would write a really good objective. So just keep these things in mind when writing objectives for your lessons. For the most part, a lot of you did really well on writing objectives in your CAP 1 assignment. Some of you need a little more help in learning how to use the correct verbs. That the hardest part are the specific and measurable, and needing to make sure that they are specific and detailed, and you can see it. You can see that the student has met that objective. Those are really important in writing an objective. Another key aspect that is in Chapter 3 this week in your reading is content progression. And as you are writing your lesson plans, I want to see progression in your lesson, meaning that you are starting off with the simple part of your lesson, the original skill that you're teaching. For example, you might be teaching lacrosse, for example. And so the skill or the initial task that you're going to be having them learn is how to cradle the lacrosse ball in their lacrosse stick. And so you give them a demonstration and you give them space and practice, time to practice for a little while of that skill that you just taught them. And then in the same lesson, probably, not always though, you would go on to the next thing, refining that skill. So these content progression um, steps are on page 68 and 69 of your book, and they're really key things to look at when you're thinking about how are you going to develop a unit or even a lesson with your students and progress through the skill that you're trying to teach your students. So after you've given them a demonstration and you had them practice it a little bit, a simple demonstration, then you refine that. Okay, so you ask them to do a little more with that. For example, now they're cradling the lacrosse ball, but now they're moving a little bit. And so maybe you have them move in and out of cones a little bit. And then after that, you might have something a little more difficult. You might have them scoop up the lacrosse ball off of the ground and then move in and out with it. See how you progress? You go from the simplest to more complex. And so by the end of your unit, you have taught them all the skills that they need to play a game of lacrosse or whatever the sport is that you're teaching them. So when you're writing your lesson plans, you're in the lesson focus part of your lesson plan, you're going to have a section that talks about what is your progression? So what are you teaching? What are you starting off with? What is the basic beginning part of that lesson? Now, if you've been teaching this sport or this activity for many weeks, and this lesson, this particular day of this lesson is within in the middle of the unit, then you wouldn't be starting with some really basic stuff because they've already learned that already. You might have them practice a few things that they've learned, but you can go faster with that. You can have them practice a little bit, like let's say basketball, you can have them practice a little bit dribbling, a little bit of passing, a little bit of shooting, and then go into the skill that they're going to learn that day, which would be something that maybe put all three of those things together in sort of like a game or something. But I hope you're getting what I'm talking about in progression. You're going to be doing that in your lessons so that as you go through the lesson, the student is progressing from a simple skill to a more advanced skill. Chapter 4 talks about classroom management. They call it managerial strategies in Chapter 4. Basically, it's what are you going to do with your students as you're teaching? So how are you going to move them from place to place? How are you going to get their attention? it starts off talking about, your book starts off talking about the start of class. This is a really important part, especially in physical education. Um, Maybe after COVID, I don't know, but whenever we're allowed to have our students dress back out again in locker rooms, students will be at different stages of dressing out. You'll have some students still in the locker room, some students already out on their numbers, ready to start the day. So you as a teacher need to have a plan for what are you going to do with those students. I know that when I was teaching, students always want to know what we were doing that day, so I would always have posted the objective of the day on a board when they came into the locker room, so they knew exactly what was happening, which teacher was teaching which unit, so they could remember, oh yeah, we're learning about football this unit, or we're doing dance this unit, or we're doing tennis this unit, or whatever it was. They could see, oh, my teacher is this teacher, and we're learning this, and today our objective is going to be this. So we did this over in the women's side of the locker room, and the men did that over on the men's side of the locker room. So when the students came in to the locker rooms, which they didn't always come in and dress out, but when they did come in and dress out, they knew what was going to happen that day. Whether it was a running day, a fitness day, whatever day it was, they knew what was to expected. And you didn't have to answer that question, what are we doing today, 20 times. It was already written there. I did have to answer it still. They forgot to read it sometimes. But once in a while, or after a while, the other student would say, didn't you read the board? And then they would tell them what we were doing that day. So once your students are out there and ready for roll, there's things you can do that don't waste a lot of time, or they can get classes going for like instant activities. Like you can have a way for them to do some warm-ups while you're taking roll. You can have them be in their roll lines and have them be doing some exercises as they're warming up and stretching and so forth. So you can be taking roll while they're actively participating in something else, and have like leaders that are leading the warm-ups and the stretches, so that you have time to take students aside to see what's going on with, like, how come they didn't dress out, or are you having a bad day, what's going on, trying to figure out maybe why they're not participating. So you have that. Especially in high school, you have more of an opportunity to hand off some of those things, such as having them warm up and leading exercises for other students in the classroom to do those things for you. Now, of course, you will have times when you'll have to discipline your students. Maybe somebody is not participating, or somebody is hurting somebody else. I taught for 32 years, so there's many different things I've tried. You just have to look at what other people are doing and try something and see if it works for you. Not everything I tried worked for me. The thing that worked the best for me in my later years was timeouts. And I tried everything from having a timeout station where the student would go to a specific area where we were, so I could still observe them, of course, and they'd have a clipboard with some paper inside and pencils, and they would sit down and answer some questions about what they had done. So we had 3 rules: play fair, play safe, and play hard. And so they'd say which one of those rules they broke and how they broke it and what they would do differently. And so they'd be answering those questions while I was still conducting class, and then I'd go back, and while I had the class doing something, I'd come over and talk to them about their answers on the paper. And then for, I would say, 99% of the time after I talked with that student, the student was ready to go back and participate and follow the rules of the classroom then. So like I said, you just need to find out what works for you and the way that you're going to handle discipline in your classroom. Please don't say, go run a lap when they misbehave. We don't want our students to connect being bad with running. We want them to enjoy running. We want them to enjoy physical activity. So don't make it a punishment to do a physical activity, or give me 10 push-ups. We don't want that physical activity to be connected to a negative thing. So we want it to be positive. So really look into what kind of things would work for you and try a few things. And, after you've done a few things, you might have to change what you do. But ask other teachers. And like I said, it took a long time. I tried a whole bunch of different things, and it doesn't work for every student. Like some discipline you have for some students won't work for some other students. So it's all you have to figure it out as you go. I'm sorry to say that, but there are things you have to try as you go to find out what really works. So in your CAPS and of course in your critical assignment, you're going to be when you're writing the lesson plans, you're going to be having a section where you're talking about management strategies. So when I talk about management strategies, I'm talking about this here in chapter 4. So if you're saying you're going to do an activity where you put students in groups, well, how did you group them? So in your textbook, chapter 4 talks about how you can group people, how you can group students, or how you could even go online and look at how teachers group students and figure out how you can do that. So one of the things is how are you going to group them? What are you going to do? How are you going to transition them? Move them from one part of the field, like for example, from their numbers to the upper field or the lower field or the tennis courts or the gym. How are you going to transition them? Are you going to have them walk in a line, which high school students, I would not suggest you do that. But how are you going to make sure you get them all there in a reasonable amount of time and you don't have somebody lagging in 10 minutes after everybody else is already in the gym? Where have you been? How are you going to get them all there and transition them from one spot to another and still be able to do your lesson correctly and in a timely manner? How are you going to hand out equipment? Are you just going to have it in a container and say, come get it, and then have a free-for-all and have everybody throwing things all over the place? How are you going to hand out equipment? So in your lesson plan, if you're talking about like let's say you're going to do a hockey lesson, well, how are they going to get their sticks? How are you going to have them pair up in partners and then one partner comes and gets a stick for themselves and for their partner? There's lots of different ways that you can have handing out equipment. You can do handing out equipment in many different ways. If you've taken kinesiology classes before, I'm sure you've come across how you're going to keep your students safe in the class. So that's another thing that you need to have in your management section. What are you going to be doing so the students know the rules? So are there going to be, like I said, we had 3 basic rules: play hard, play fair, play safe, and those are the only 3 rules they had to remember. So you don't want a whole list of rules for them. You want some simple rules, and those 3 rules we felt as a physical education department encompassed every single thing, from throwing rocks at each other to saying hurtful words to each other. So all those things were encompassed in those 3 rules. So having some kind of rules for your classes to follow, your students to follow, is also part of managing your classes. And what are you going to do when they break those rules? Of course, that's important also. Also, watching your students. You are responsible for them. So making sure you are always having an eye on them no matter where they're going or what they're doing. A good visual of them. Physical education fields are huge sometimes, but being able to see where they are and what they're doing and not having them hide around corners and so forth is really important. So not just staying in one place, but walking around as you're teaching, and as the students are playing and doing their skills, you're not just standing in one place, but you're walking from place to place so that you can see everything that's going on and see visually and hear what's going on with your students too. So don't go sit and have some coffee and read a newspaper while your kids are playing. Be actively involved in your students and able to keep a good eye on them and watch them and keep yourself from getting in trouble. So at the end of every lesson, one thing I would like to do, what I like to do would be to have students review what we learned. Like let's say we were learning how to throw a football, and the objective was to be able to throw the football through a hula hoop 8 out of 10 times. I might have said, hey, thumbs up if you got all 8 or more through the hoop, and then I could see visually who did that and who didn't. Thumbs down if they didn't, thumbs up if they did. So little things like that to just sort of informally assess what's going on. Every lesson doesn't have to have a written test to it. Now, I did have written tests, and of course students would always balk at that. Why are we writing in PE? Well, it is part of the curriculum, so we do writing. So written tests and so forth were important for it. But I didn't have a written test or anything written down on paper specifically from the students every lesson. So daily we'd have informal assessments where the kids would give me thumbs up, thumbs down. We'd do like from 1 to 5, they'd give me a number. Like 1 would be I didn't really get this, and 5 would be I got it totally. So different hand signals, different things, so that I would know what's going on with the students. And especially like if you have 50 kids, I know that at one time I did have 53 kids in my class. That's a lot of students that you have to go through. And if you're assessing and asking each one a question, it could take you a minute to ask every kid a question in the class, and now you have no class left. So you have to come up with things that you can just assess group-wise and be able to see what's going on, how they're feeling. And the ones that are struggling, you're going to look at their thumbs up or thumbs down first, and then you can catch what's going on with them the next lesson. So being able to assess your students is also an important thing, and it talks about it in chapter 4 also. I didn't intend for this lecture to be so long, so sorry about that, but hopefully you went through the whole you listened to it all the way through, and I won't talk about some of these things in some of my other lectures because I talked about them here, so some of those other ones might be shorter.